Spring break is supposed to be the ultimate escape for college students. It is a time for leaving the stress of exams behind, packing a bag, and heading out for a week of pure relaxation or high-energy partying. You save up your money, you make plans with your closest friends, and you expect to make memories that will last a lifetime. But sometimes those plans take a very dark turn. Sometimes, the place you choose to escape to is the exact place where someone is waiting for you. And if you are not careful, a simple vacation can quickly turn into a fight for your absolute survival. Our first story takes us back about 4 years ago, right around spring break. A young man and his girlfriend, Anna, wanted to do something incredibly low-key. Anna had been dealing with a brutal semester at school. She was completely burnt out and had been talking about a cabin trip for months. She did not want a crowded beach or a loud resort. She just wanted somewhere quiet where they could disappear for a few days with absolutely no obligations. Around this same time, Anna's brother, Hunter, was on break from his own school and was staying with them anyway. So they decided to make it a trio and bring him along. The narrator started looking for places online, searching through rental sites for something secluded but budget-friendly. Eventually, he found a listing that seemed perfect. It was a rustic cabin located pretty deep in the woods. The description praised its privacy and peace, and the price was incredibly cheap. It was actually far cheaper than it had any right to be, considering its size and location. The narrator remembers thinking about that price discrepancy very briefly, but then he quickly brushed it off. He figured they were just getting a great deal, and did not think about it again. They booked the place and packed their bags. They arrived at the cabin on a Friday evening, right around dinner time. As they drove down the long, winding dirt road that led to the property, the sense of isolation really started to set in. The trees were dense and crowded close to the path. By the time they parked the car in the grass driveway, they realized the place was genuinely cut off from the rest of the world. You could not even see the main road they had driven on from the front porch. At the time, they actually liked this. It felt like the perfect escape, but as they were unpacking their things, they noticed an outbuilding off to the side of the property. It was a large wooden shed, and it had a heavy padlock on the door. Hunter, being a curious guy, walked over and played with the lock for a second. He turned back to the narrator and said that the lock looked brand new, like it had been swapped out very recently. The metal was shiny and completely free of rust, which stood out against the weathered wood of the old shed. The narrator shrugged and said it was probably just the owner keeping some expensive tools or maintenance equipment in there. They did not really think much of it, because the sun was setting and it was getting dark fast. They went inside the cabin and immediately started making dinner. That first night actually started out fine. They cooked some food, had a few drinks on the back porch, and listened to the sounds of the forest. It was incredibly peaceful. They went to bed pretty early, feeling relaxed. At some point during the night, it started to lightly rain. The woods became very loud, which was a major surprise to the narrator. It was this constant, heavy wall of sound made up of thousands of insects and frogs. Something about that natural noise was actually very calming, and it helped them drift off. But before the narrator fell asleep, he heard something heavy moving around out there in the dark. It sounded like branches snapping and leaves rustling. He figured it was just a deer or some other harmless animal, so he did not worry. He fell asleep not long after that. But a few hours later, something woke him up. It was a sharp, heavy sound. It sounded like something solid hitting the side of the cabin. The narrator froze there in bed, his eyes wide open in the dark. He wondered if what he had heard was just part of a dream. He lay there for a minute, holding his breath, trying to listen over the sound of the rain. Just as he was about to convince himself to go back to sleep, he heard another loud thump. It sounded identical to the first one, right against the wooden exterior wall of the cabin. He rolled over to see if Anna was awake, but she was fast asleep, completely undisturbed. The narrator knew it was up to him to go investigate. He really did not want to leave the warm bed, but the thought of a bear poking around their porch or damaging their car was enough to make him move. It would be better to know what was out there than to just lie in bed panicking. So, he reluctantly got out of bed and grabbed one of the heavy flashlights they had brought. He did not want to actually go outside, so he walked over to the windows first. The visibility through the glass was extremely limited because of the darkness and the rain. But as he wiped the condensation off the glass and stared out into the yard, he noticed something that made his stomach drop. There were distinct footsteps pressed into the wet mud on the ground near the padlocked outbuilding. These footprints could not have been theirs. None of us had been outside the cabin after the rain had started, at least, not to my knowledge. The narrator tried to reason with himself. He thought it was possible that Hunter had gone outside in the middle of the night for some reason, without anyone realizing it. He figured he would just ask him about it in the morning. Still, deep down, he was pretty confident that Hunter would not have done that, which made the entire situation feel incredibly eerie. The footprint did not look like an animal's tracks at all. They were clearly made by boots, although they were too far away to see the exact tread. If the narrator had been unwilling to go outside before, there was absolutely no chance he was going out there now. He made sure the front and back doors were securely locked, crept back to his room, and tried to go back to sleep. Unfortunately, the night was far from over. A few hours later, the narrator was jolted awake again. This time, it was not a random thump. It was a loud, aggressive knocking on the front door. Hearing a knock on a door at 4 in the morning in the middle of nowhere is one of the most terrifying things you can experience. It immediately means there is a stranger standing on your porch, right on the other side of a thin piece of wood. The narrator's heart rate spiked instantly. There was absolutely no good reason for anyone to be knocking on a secluded cabin door at that hour. The loud knocking also woke up Anna, who was immediately 10 times more scared than the narrator. She sat up in bed, trembling. The narrator knew he had to do something, so he got up and walked quietly over to the door. But before he could even ask who was there or announce his presence, the person on the other side spoke. The man had a calm, flat voice. He said he was a forest ranger. He claimed there had been some kind of incident in the immediate area, and that he was conducting a welfare check on the occupants of the cabin. The narrator paused before responding. He was paralyzed by fear, but he knew the person on the porch already heard him moving around. He told the man through the closed door that they were all good, that they did not need to be checked up on, and that they just wanted to get back to sleep. He hoped the guy would just take the hint and walk away. The man on the porch went silent for a moment, but instead of leaving, he spoke again. He said he would still need them to open the door, so he could ask them a few quick questions. At this point, the narrator became extremely suspicious. He was almost fully confident that the person on the other side of that door was not any kind of law enforcement or forest ranger. The timing was too perfect, and the request felt incredibly off. Just then, Hunter crept out of his room. He had been woken up by the noise, and was now standing right behind the narrator, looking pale. The narrator turned to Hunter and whispered for him to call the police immediately. He told Hunter that he would try to stall the guy at the door. The narrator went back and forth with the man outside, giving him vague, empty answers to buy time. He tried his best not to show his suspicion or let the man know that they were onto him. After a few agonizing minutes, Hunter walked back up to the narrator and whispered some chilling news. The police dispatcher had just told him that there were absolutely no forest rangers dispatched to that area tonight. There was no welfare check. Hearing Hunter say those words out loud made the narrator's heart rate kick up to a whole new level. He was outright panicking. It was 4 in the morning. They were truly in the middle of nowhere with no neighbors for miles, and some strange man was banging on their door pretending to be an officer. It felt like the person on the porch could actually sense their fear through the wood, because his tone suddenly changed. He raised his voice, getting much louder, and started banging on the door with massive force. The narrator decided to stop playing along. He yelled through the door that he was not going to open it, and that he was not going to answer any more questions. This only seemed to make the intruder furious. The man began demanding that they open the door immediately, threatening to kick it down, and telling them they would be arrested for failure to comply with a law enforcement officer. Hearing this, Anna lost her composure and screamed at the top of her lungs for the man to go away. That scream only made things worse. The man started violently kicking the front door, trying to force the lock. When the heavy wood did not give way, they heard him stomp off the porch and start walking around the perimeter of the cabin. The narrator rushed over to Anna and told her to go lock herself in the bathroom immediately, which she did crying. Then, the narrator and Hunter ran to the kitchen and grabbed the biggest knives they could find. They stood in the middle of the living room, completely silent, tracking the heavy thudding sounds of the man's boots as he moved around the outside of the cabin. The narrator was beyond terrified, but he knew he had no choice but to prepare for a brutal fight. This man was not a ranger. He meant them serious harm, and he was actively trying to find a way inside to get to them. Before the narrator could even process his next move, the quiet of the night was shattered. One of the side windows exploded into a million tiny pieces. The man had picked up a large rock from the yard and hurled it right through the glass. The narrator and Hunter froze, staring at the gaping hole in the window. The narrator fully expected the man to climb through the broken frame at any second, knife in hand, ready to attack. It was the absolute tensest, most terrifying moment of his life. They stood there, holding their kitchen knives, waiting for the physical confrontation. But then, after what felt like an absolute eternity of staring at the broken window, they heard a beautiful sound. Far off in the distance, the faint wail of police sirens was echoing through the trees. The intruder must have heard it too, because they heard the sound of heavy footsteps sprinting away into the dark woods. The police arrived shortly after. They searched the entire property with flashlights and K9 units, but miraculously, they could not find the guy. He had completely vanished into the dense forest. Hunter was absolutely furious. He was practically screaming at the officers, telling them that the freak had been standing right on their property, less than a minute before the patrol cars arrived, so there was no way he could have gone far. But the officers just shook their heads. They said there was nothing more they could do tonight in the dark and the rain, and they strongly advised the group to just pack up their things and leave immediately. And that is exactly what they did. It was not like they had much of a choice anyway. They threw their clothes into their bags, ran to the car, and sped away from that nightmare cabin. But as they drove, Hunter could not let go of how incompetent he felt the officers were being. It was only after the initial wave of fear and adrenaline started to wear off that the narrator realized how truly insane the whole situation was. For someone to even know that cabin existed, and to know that people were staying there in the first place, was highly unlikely. It felt incredibly targeted, like someone had planned the entire thing. What that man actually wanted from them remains a mystery, and it is an extremely uncomfortable and unsettling memory that they still carry to this day. Our second story takes us back to the spring of 2016. The narrator of this account was a senior in college at the time. He was a member of a fraternity called Tau Kappa Epsilon, or TKE for short. One of the massive traditions that came with being in Greek life at their school was spending spring break with your fraternity brothers, and whatever sororities they were close with. These trips were always massive. We are talking 30 or 40 college students, all packing into the exact same rental house or resort for an entire week. The narrator admits it was not the most wholesome or safe environment for a bunch of people in their early 20s, but he also will not pretend that he did not have an absolute blast doing it. That year the group had decided to go to Acapulco, Mexico. It was a massive trip. Within a few weeks of planning, they had about 40 people booked at a beautiful resort right on the Pacific coast. But the main character of this specific story is not the narrator. It is his close friend, a guy named Sahil. To put it as nicely as possible, Sahil was the kind of person who, no matter what situation you put him in, was going to find a way to make it much louder and way more complicated than it ever needed to be. The narrator says this with absolute affection, because Sahil was genuinely one of his best friends in college. He was incredibly loyal and fun to be around, but he had absolutely zero self-preservation instincts. He had no impulse control, which was a massive problem, because he was also incredibly impulsive. About 3 or 4 days into the trip, a group of them decided to leave the resort and check out the local clubs in the city. It was a fantastic night. The music was loud, The drinks were flowing, and everyone was having a great time. That was until Sahil, true to form, started scanning the crowded room. He was looking for someone who could sell him something a bit stronger than the alcohol in his glass. The narrator knew this was a terrible idea. They were in a foreign country, in a city that did not have the cleanest reputation when it came to safety and crime. On top of that, absolutely nobody in their group spoke any Spanish. The narrator grabbed Sahil and told him to drop it, warning him that it was too dangerous to mess around with strangers in a place like this. A few of the other guys stepped in and said the same thing. Sahil nodded and said he would drop it, but the narrator knew his friend too well. He knew Sahil would not actually listen. They tried to keep an eye on him for a while, but the club was absolutely massive and packed with hundreds of people. After a while, they naturally lost track of where Sahil was. He was a grown man, and the narrator was not about to spend his entire vacation babysitting him. He figured Sahil was just dancing or talking to some girls in the crowd. Disappearing into a crowd was a very normal thing for Sahil to do. The narrator went back to partying with his other friends, having a great time. But as the hours ticked by, Sahil never turned up. The later it got, the more uneasy the group became. At some point, the mood shifted. One second, they were all drinking and laughing, and the next, they were all frantically pulling out their phones trying to call and text Sahil, but he was not answering any of their messages. When they tried to call his phone, it went straight to voicemail, meaning the battery was completely dead. This was incredibly alarming. Even though Sahil was a wild guy, he was an absolute freak when it came to organization. He always made sure his phone was fully charged before going out, and he would never just let his phone die in a crowded place in a foreign country. After waiting a bit longer, they made the unanimous decision to head back to the resort. They figured there was a good chance Sahil had just gotten too drunk, taken a taxi back early, and was currently passed out in his hotel bed. When they walked outside the club, the sidewalk was a complete disaster. There were hundreds of people all trying to hail cabs at the exact same time. Realizing they would never get a ride right in front of the venue, the narrator and a few of his friends decided to walk about a block and a half away to find a quieter spot and call a driver on their phones. It was around 1 in the morning, and they were just standing on the dark street corner waiting for their ride. Suddenly, they saw a figure stumbling toward them out of the darkness. As the person got closer, they realized it was Sahil. They ran up to him, and it was immediately obvious that something incredibly terrible had happened. Sahil was an absolute wreck. His shirt was torn almost completely off his body. His face was swollen and bruised, and he was limping heavily. The group was in shock. They quickly bundled him into the taxi that had just arrived, and got him back to the safety of the resort. During the entire car ride back, the guys kept frantically asking Sahil what had happened, but Sahil was too shaken up to speak. He just kept shaking his head and whispering that he would explain everything once they were back in the room. Once they got him upstairs and settled into one of the hotel rooms, Sahil finally started to talk. He told them that after they had warned him to stop, he had ignored their advice and gone looking for a dealer anyway. He eventually found a short Mexican man standing near the bar who did not speak much English, but the short man had a friend standing next to him who was acting as a translator. Sahil made it clear what he was looking for, and the short man seemed to understand. Sahil admitted that he felt a sudden wave of reluctance right away. Something about the translator felt incredibly off, though he could not quite put his finger on what it was. But then, the short man pulled out a small sample of the substance and offered it to Sahil right there. Sahil tried it and said it was good, and as soon as he did, his remaining judgment completely evaporated. The short man then told Sahil that they could not do the actual business inside the club because of security, and he told Sahil to follow him outside. Sahil knew deep down that he should not go. He knew it was a massive risk, but the substance had clouded his mind, and he followed them anyway. They walked out of a side exit of the club, and there was a car idling right outside the door. Before Sahil could even fully comprehend what was happening, the two men grabbed him and pulled him into the back seat, slamming the doors shut behind him. The car immediately sped off. Sahil said they drove for what felt like 15 or 20 minutes. He was in a state of absolute panic and was not thinking straight, so he could not be sure of the exact time. But what he was absolutely sure of was that the moment the car started moving, the two men turned on him. They began aggressively rummaging through his pockets. They robbed him of his wallet, his watch, and his money. When Sahil tried to resist and fight back, they began to beat him mercilessly. They punched him in the face, struck him in the ribs, and completely shattered his phone before stripping him of every single thing of value. But then, something incredible happened. During the drive, while Sahil was bleeding in the back seat, one of the men asked him why there were so many young Americans in the city right now. Sahil, who was terrified and just rambling without really thinking, explained that he was there on spring break. He told them that he was part of a massive group of dozens of students from the exact same American university, and that they were all staying together at a prominent resort nearby. At the time, Sahil had no idea that this simple explanation was actually saving his life. The two men went silent for a moment, and then they began talking rapidly back and forth in Spanish. Sahil could not understand what they were saying, but he could tell they sounded stressed. It turns out, by telling them that he was part of a massive organized group of college students staying at a highly visible resort, he made them realize that his sudden disappearance would be noticed immediately. The university and the resort would get involved. The police would be called, and it would create a massive international incident that would bring heat down on their operation. He was too high risk of a target to keep or kill. After a tense back and forth conversation, the driver suddenly pulled the car over to the side of a dark road and threw Sahil out onto the dirt. He landed hard, scraping his knees and elbows, and watched the taillights of the car disappear into the night. He was left on some random road he did not recognize at all. He had no phone, no money, and no idea where he was. With no other options, Sahil just started walking in the direction he thought the car had driven. By some absolute miracle, his sense of direction was correct. He managed to walk all the way back to the main strip where his friends were waiting. The narrator realizes that if Sahil had not run into them, or if he had left the club just 20 minutes earlier, things could have ended in tragedy. The group debated calling the local police for about 3 seconds before they all unanimously decided that it was probably the worst idea. In a city like Acapulco, involving the local authorities could lead to corruption, endless questioning, or even worse trouble for Sahil. They decided to keep the entire incident quiet. Besides the small group of guys who were there that night, nobody else at the resort ever found out what had happened to Sahil. They spent the rest of the trip keeping a very close eye on him, grateful that he had made it back alive. Our third and final story is one that the narrator has kept bottled up for a very long time. This happened during the spring break of his junior year of college. The narrator admits that he is naturally a very paranoid person. He has always been highly observant, skeptical, and cynical of the people and situations around him. He knows these are not the healthiest traits to have, and he often spends way too much time overthinking things that probably do not matter. But in this case, his paranoia was the only thing that kept them safe. His girlfriend at the time, Anna, had a very social friend named Lena. Lena was the kind of girl who was constantly plugged into every single social circle, group chat, and event imaginable. She always knew where the party was. So it was not surprising at all when Lena approached Anna with a detailed plan for spring break. Lena said that a girl she knew from another social circle had told her about a massive lake house trip out in the Ozarks. According to Lena, a bunch of people from that girl's sorority and some of the affiliated fraternities were renting a massive luxury house right on the water for the week. It sounded like a pretty standard college spring break trip. The narrator was not really the partying type, but Anna was incredibly excited about the idea and really wanted to go. Since he did not have a valid reason to say no, he figured he would just go along with it. There were 4 of them in total making the trip. The narrator, Anna, Lena, and Lena's boyfriend, a guy named Colby. Colby had a large SUV, so he offered to drive everyone, which was a very cool gesture. The drive was long, but the atmosphere in the car was great. Everyone was in a wonderful mood, talking and listening to music. As they got closer to the destination, the roads turned into long, twisting, narrow paths lined with dense trees, with very few houses in sight. Finally, around 5 in the afternoon, they pulled up to the property. The narrator's first thought was that Lena had severely undersold the place. The lake house was absolutely massive. It was a multi-story luxury home sitting right on the edge of the water, featuring a humongous wrap-around wooden deck and a private dock that stretched far out over the lake. It was the kind of house that made you immediately wonder what kind of incredibly wealthy person actually owned it. But the narrator also noticed something else right away. There were way more cars parked in the front of the house than he had been expecting. Lena had made it sound like there would only be 15 or 20 people attending. But as they pulled in, the narrator counted at least 25 cars packed into a makeshift grass parking lot next to the house, with several more cars parked far down the side of the narrow road because there was simply no more room. Because of the crowd, Colby had to park his SUV quite a distance down the road. They grabbed their bags and walked up the wooden steps to the front door. Standing near the entrance was a guy who appeared to be about their age, maybe slightly older. He was clean-cut and friendly. He introduced himself, but the narrator cannot remember his name, so we will just call him the host. The host welcomed them warmly, but the narrator's natural paranoia immediately picked up on something strange. The host's speech sounded incredibly rehearsed. It felt like a script he had repeated dozens of times already that day. It reminded the narrator of the safety speeches that fraternity pledges are forced to memorize and recite before letting people into a party. It just felt artificial. The host gave them a quick rundown of the house rules. He told them where the bedrooms were, how to navigate the hallways, and what areas were off limits. Then he brought up the car keys. He explained that the roads around the lake were extremely narrow and dangerous at night, especially once people started drinking. He said that for safety and liability reasons, they were collecting everyone's car keys at the door. He had a whole little speech prepared for this, emphasizing that it was just to make sure nobody did anything stupid. Colby did not think much of it. He just shrugged, reached into his pocket, and handed his keys over to the host. The host made a big show of thanking Colby for playing by the rules and being responsible. The narrator thought this display was incredibly obnoxious and unnecessary. But as the host opened the front door to let them in, the narrator took a quick look around the entryway. Sure enough, sitting on a table in the foyer was a large glass bowl filled to the brim with dozens of other car keys. The host tossed Colby's keys into the bowl, smiled, and told them to go have fun before stepping back outside and closing the door. They went upstairs, found their assigned room, which had 2 double beds and a tiny balcony overlooking the water, and unpacked their things. Lena was incredibly eager to find her friends, so they all headed back downstairs to join the party. It did not take long to find the main lounge. It was a massive, open-concept room on the first floor, lined with floor-to-ceiling glass windows that offered a stunning, panoramic view of the lake. There were at least 30 people hanging out in that one room, talking, drinking, and playing games. But as they walked into the crowd, Lena's face fell. She looked around the room in confusion. She did not recognize a single person there. Everyone looked like typical college kids. The exact kind of Greek life crowd you would expect at a spring break party. But Lena could not find her friend or anyone else she knew from her school. The narrator did not want to stand in the corner feeling awkward, so he walked over to the fridge, grabbed a couple of beers for himself and Colby, and headed over to a pool table that was currently unoccupied. The narrator had never had a hard time socializing, so he did not really care that they did not know anyone yet. Colby did not seem to care either. They played pool, drank their beers, and enjoyed the lively atmosphere. A little while later, Anna and Lena came over. Lena looked stressed and said her friend was not answering her phone calls or text messages. Colby and the narrator told her not to worry about it, assuring her that her friend was probably just on her way or busy partying somewhere else. To be completely fair, that first night was actually really fun. The narrator and Colby ended up talking and socializing with a bunch of people who seemed really cool. Anna and Lena started getting along with some of the girls, and there was an endless supply of alcohol and party games. But despite the fun, there was one detail that kept nagging at the narrator. It was the host. He was not actually partying or drinking at all. Instead, he was constantly moving through the rooms, observing everyone. At first, the narrator thought the guy might just be using some other substances in a back room, but it still felt off. At one point, the narrator saw the host standing near the back exit, holding an actual physical clipboard with paper on it, diligently writing something down as he watched the crowd. As the night went on, the narrator noticed another strange social dynamic. Most of the people at the party behaved like strangers who were just getting to know each other, which made sense. But there was a specific group of about 8 to 10 people who interacted with each other very differently. They seemed very familiar and comfortable with one another. However, the narrator noticed that during group games, these same people would introduce themselves to each other, as if they were meeting for the very first time. It was highly contradictory. On top of that, the narrator realized that the party was not made up of a couple of large connected groups. Instead, the entire house was split into several tiny, isolated groups of 3 or 4 people, just like theirs. Aside from those 10 core people who seemed to be running things, absolutely nobody at the house knew anyone outside of the small group they had arrived with. The narrator mentioned this observation to Anna, but she just laughed and told him he was overthinking things as usual. She was pretty drunk by that point, so the narrator decided to drop the subject. Lena's friend never showed up that night. The next morning, the narrator woke up much earlier than everyone else. He went down to the quiet kitchen, brewed a cup of coffee, and walked out onto the deck to enjoy the peace. As he passed the front entryway, he noticed that the glass bowl filled with everyone's car keys was no longer sitting on the table. It had been completely removed. He decided to sit on the side of the house where he could see the driveway to his left and the water to his right. Around mid-morning, he watched a young couple whom he recognized from the night before packing their bags into their car. They said goodbye to a few people on the porch, started their engine, and drove out of sight down the road, fast forward to later that night. Everyone was gathered around a massive bonfire in the backyard near the water. The narrator was sitting with Anna, chatting with some other guests, when he happened to glance across the flames toward the far side of the circle. Sitting slightly behind the main group, shrouded in the shadows, was a couple. The narrator squinted. Even with the fire distorting his view, he felt a sudden shock of recognition. It was the exact same couple he had watched pack up their bags and drive away that morning. He was absolutely certain of it. He nudged Anna and pointed them out, but Anna gave him a confused look. She had not seen them leave in the morning, so she just assumed the narrator was misremembering things and seeing double. Frustrated and uneasy, the narrator got up from the fire and walked through the house to the front driveway. He knew exactly what car that couple had been driving. He scanned the crowded grass lot, and to his surprise, their car was not there. The driveway was packed, but that specific vehicle was definitely gone. Yet, he was positive that the people sitting by the fire were the owners of that car. When he walked back down to the bonfire to get a closer look, the couple had vanished. He searched the backyard and the main rooms of the house, but he could not find them anywhere. This completely ruined the rest of his night, but every time he tried to bring it up to Anna, she told him he was being a psychotic buzzkill and ruining the vacation. The next morning, the narrator woke up early again. He knew he had to figure out what was going on. He decided to go for a long walk down the narrow dirt road, away from the house. He was not even sure what he was looking for, but he felt an overwhelming need to prove to himself that he was not losing his mind. About a quarter mile down the road, past a sharp bend that completely hid the main house from view, he came across a small metal equipment shed. It looked like a storage building used by local groundskeeping staff. The narrator walked around to the back of the shed, and his jaw practically hit the ground. Parked right there, hidden entirely from the road and the house, was the couple's car. He just stood there in the quiet woods, staring at the vehicle. He was not even scared yet. It was more of a chilling confirmation. The couple had made a massive show of saying goodbye and driving away, only to park their car behind a hidden shed and walk back to the property through the woods. Why would anyone do that? Why would the organizers want everyone to think people were leaving when they were actually staying? And those people they had said goodbye to, were they in on the lie too? The narrator turned around and walked back to the house in silence. He was starting to seriously panic. That afternoon, he spotted the couple walking down by the dock. He made up an excuse to leave Anna's side, walked straight up to them, and bluntly asked them if they had left the morning before. The couple froze. They exchanged a quick, tense look, and then they both laughed and treated him like he was absolutely insane. But the narrator could see the genuine panic in their eyes. His direct question had struck a major nerve. Suddenly, the narrator realized that the surrounding area had gone quiet. There were only a few other people nearby on the dock, but they had all stopped talking and were staring directly at him. He felt an intense, heavy weight of dozens of eyes locking onto him. Before things could get more awkward, Anna appeared out of nowhere, grabbed his arm, and told him to come have a drink with her. The narrator reluctantly walked away, but the creepy reaction of the crowd made him feel sick to his stomach. He dragged Anna to a quiet corner and explained the hidden car to her. Seeing how dead serious he was, Anna finally started to take him seriously. She admitted that she had also noticed some incredibly weird things. She said that some of the girls she had been talking to had almost identical, rehearsed backstories, down to the exact same phrasing. The narrator suggested that they pack up and leave immediately, but Anna hesitated, saying that leaving in the middle of the day might be premature and make them look crazy. They decided to find Colby and Lena to discuss it, but when they told Colby and Lena, the reaction was not what they expected. Colby straight up laughed in the narrator's face. He said he was not going to cut his spring break trip short, just because the narrator had a wild conspiracy theory about a parked car. Lena agreed, saying that while it was weird that her friend had ghosted her, she was not going to panic and leave a great party over nothing. They argued for a while, and the narrator was stunned by how stubborn his friends were being. He and Anna could not leave on their own because Colby had the car keys, and they were locked away somewhere in the house. Eventually, they reached a tense compromise. They would stay for one final night and leave first thing the next morning. But when they went downstairs for breakfast the next day, the atmosphere had completely changed. The moment the narrator walked into the kitchen, he felt it. Every single set of eyes in the room turned to look at him. It was not obvious or loud, but people were definitely staring. He tried to tell himself he was just being paranoid. But as he looked around, he realized that many of the people staring at him were guests he had never even spoken to. There was no way they should have cared about him, unless the host and the core group had warned everyone about his questions. The narrator felt an overwhelming, instinctual dread. He knew with absolute certainty that if they stayed in that house for one more night, something truly terrible was going to happen to them. Anna felt it too. She leaned in close and whispered that they needed to get out of there right now. The narrator did not hesitate. He stood up, walked straight across the room, and approached the host, who was standing in the corner watching the room. The narrator kept his voice firm and told the host that an emergency had come up. They had to leave immediately, and he needed Colby's car keys back. The host did not react naturally. He just stared at the narrator and smiled like a terrifying malfunctioning robot. He asked if everything was okay. The narrator lied and said there was a family emergency back home, and they had to leave right away. Instead of getting the keys, the host started trying to aggressively divert the conversation. He told the narrator that some people had planned a big boat trip on the lake for that evening, and that the parties always got much better toward the end of the week. He was doing everything he could to convince them to stay. All while maintaining that creepy artificial smile, the narrator did not back down. He stepped closer and demanded the keys again. At that moment, the entire main room went dead silent. The music seemed to fade away, and all 25 people in the lounge stopped what they were doing and turned to stare at the narrator. The host's charming smile instantly vanished. His face went completely blank, and he stared at the narrator with cold, dead eyes. A random girl sitting on a nearby couch broke the silence. She stared at the narrator with a deep scowl and said, in a cold voice, that leaving was not a good idea. The narrator looked back at Anna, Colby, and Lena. They were all standing near the kitchen, looking absolutely horrified. They had finally realized that this was not a normal party. The host finally broke his silence. He nodded slowly, said fine, and told the narrator to follow him to get the keys. Anna stepped forward to follow them, but the host immediately spun around, held his hand up, and barked a loud, aggressive no. His voice was so sharp and violent that it startled everyone in the room. He pointed at the narrator and said that only he was allowed to follow him. With his heart hammering in his chest, the narrator followed the host through a winding maze of dark hallways in the back of the house. They finally reached a small, windowless utility room. Hanging on the wall were dozens of hooks, each holding a set of car keys. The host did not even ask which keys belonged to Colby's SUV. He walked straight over, grabbed Colby's keys off a specific hook, and turned around. He clearly knew exactly which keys belonged to them the entire time. The narrator prepared himself for an attack, bracing for the host to pull a weapon. But instead, the host just stepped close, pressed the keys into the narrator's hand, and whispered, "You are making a mistake." The narrator did not say a single word. He snatched the keys, turned around, and sprinted back down the hallway to the main room. The moment he walked back into the lounge, the music was suddenly playing again, and people were laughing and talking as if nothing had happened. It was the most surreal and disturbing thing he had ever witnessed. He grabbed Anna, Colby, and Lena, and they ran upstairs. They threw their clothes into their bags, flew down the stairs, and ran out the front door. They did not care about packing neatly. They just wanted to run. They loaded the SUV in record time. As Colby started the engine and began to back down the narrow driveway, the narrator looked back at the massive lake house. What he saw made his blood run cold. Standing in a perfect, silent line along the edge of the high wooden deck were about a dozen people from the party. They were not talking, they were not waving, and they were not smiling. They were just standing there, shoulder to shoulder, silently watching the SUV drive away. Through the glass windows of the house, the narrator could see several more people staring out at them. The entire place was a trap. They drove in absolute silence for hours, the terror of what they had just escaped hanging heavy in the air. For the rest of the spring break, Lena tried desperately to contact the friend who had supposedly invited her to the trip. She called, texted, and messaged every single social media account, but received absolutely no response. She started to fear that her friend had been kidnapped or killed. It was not until they finally returned to campus after the break that Lena managed to track her friend down in person. And what they discovered was the most terrifying part of the entire ordeal. Her friend's phone had been stolen out of her purse at a bar 2 weeks before spring break. She had gotten a new phone and a new number, but she had not had a chance to update everyone in her contacts yet. The person who had been messaging Lena, pretending to be her friend, and inviting her to the remote lake house, was an absolute stranger. The real friend had absolutely no idea that any lake house trip was even happening. They talked about going to the police, but they realized they had no real evidence of a crime. They had gone to a house, hung out, and left. Nobody had physically harmed them, and nobody had stolen their things. But the narrator knows, deep in his gut, that if they had stayed for that final night, they would have ended up just like that hidden car behind the shed. All three of these stories serve as a chilling reminder of how fragile our safety really is. Whether you are seeking a quiet cabin in the woods, a fun escape in a foreign city, or a massive party at a luxury lake house, there are people out there who look for the vulnerable. They look for the isolated, the distracted, and the unsuspecting. And sometimes, the only thing standing between a fun vacation and a horrific tragedy is your own intuition. If something feels off, do not ignore it. It might just save your life. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya.